This was not a film. It was a confession. Everyone remembers Rosemary's Baby as a horror classic about a woman who fears her neighbors. Almost nobody asks why the building behind her, the timeline around her, and the man who made her all point to the same uncomfortable place. Today, we open that place. Watch the building first, not the actress, not the plot. The building. Because it was never a set. It stood before the cameras arrived, and it is still standing now. And something about its silhouette against the New York sky has made people cross the street rather than walk beneath its gate for over a century. Tenants who have lived there for decades use a nickname for it that they will not say to strangers. We will say it. Later, when you understand why it earned it. Here is the part that almost nobody seems to want to discuss honestly. A director finds a novel. He asks his location scout for an apartment building that already feels wrong before a single scene is shot. Not menacing in the cheap sense. Nothing with cobwebs, nothing with a groundskeeper who warns you away at midnight. He wants something worse. Something respectable. Something with doormen and awnings and a history that polite society has agreed, by mutual and quiet consent, not to mention at dinner parties. They find it. Before we go further, a brief note, the kind we give at the start of every descent. What follows is derived from documented production history, published memoirs, court records, and esoteric interpretive traditions. It is not established science, and I'm not asking you to believe any of it literally. I am asking you to look at the dates, the names, and the pattern they make, and decide for yourself what you are looking at. Because the pattern is the whole reason we are here tonight. Rosemary's Baby began as a novel, Ira Levin's, published in 1967, a slim, cold, almost clinical book about a young wife who becomes convinced her elderly neighbors are witches, conspiring to use her body as a vessel. Levin wrote it fast, sold it faster, and by the time the film adaptation reached theaters in 1968, the novel had already made him a household name among people who read horror the way others read the financial pages, carefully for what it might predict. The studio wanted a competent thriller. What they got was something else entirely, and the man responsible for the difference was a young Polish director named Roman Polanski, freshly arrived in Hollywood, already carrying a body of work obsessed with confinement, paranoia, and the particular terror of a woman alone in a room she cannot fully trust. He needed a building. Not any building, the building. And when his scouts brought him to the corner of 72nd Street and Central Park West, to a Gothic pile of turrets and gables completed in 1884, he reportedly knew within minutes that he had found his Bramford. That building has a real name. We will use it properly from here forward, because pretending otherwise insults the story. It is the Dakota. This needs to sit for a moment. The Dakota was not built to be a film prop. It was built as a monument to a very particular kind of Gilded Age ambition, a fortress of apartments so far uptown, so isolated when it opened, that New Yorkers joked it might as well have been built in the Dakota Territory, hence the name, hence the joke that became permanent. Its architect gave it gargoyles. Its architect gave it a deep, shadowed gatehouse that visitors must pass through before they ever see daylight again on the other side. Its architect, whether he intended it or not, gave the building bones that read, to anyone trained to read such things, less like a home and more like a threshold. We will come back to that architecture in detail, because the geometry of that gatehouse and the floor plan Polanski's own production designer would later build to mirror it soundstage side is not incidental to this story. It may be the center of it. For now, hold this fact quietly in your hand. Polanski shot his exteriors at the real Dakota, and something about doing so seems to have opened a door that did not close again for years. The interesting question is not whether it exists. The interesting question is why, across the accounts of nearly everyone who worked on this production, the same unease keeps surfacing about the same building, the same year, the same short list of names. Because here is the timeline, laid bare the way almost no retrospective bothers to lay it. The film premieres. Within the year, the man who wrote its now famous wordless lullaby, the melody that plays under the opening titles, the one that has been called one of the most quietly disturbing pieces of music ever put in a horror film, is dead. Not old, not sick. A fall. A stupid, mundane fall at a party. The kind of accident that happens to thousands of people every year and means nothing. Except it happened to him at 37, less than 12 months after his score reached theaters, and the people who knew him have spent decades insisting there was more to that night than the official account allows. We will give him his name and his full account very soon. The producer who fought hardest to bring this story to the screen, a man famous for gimmicks, for showmanship, for treating horror as a carnival ride, survives the production and then nearly does not survive what follows. He will later write in his own memoir, in his own words, that he believed himself cursed, not metaphorically. He used the word plainly and meant it. And then there is the director's own household. Less than a year after this film about a woman terrorized inside her own home by people she trusted reaches its widest audience, the director's pregnant wife is murdered inside their home, in a killing so calculated, so ritualized in its staging, that investigators and occultists alike have spent half a century arguing over what exactly they were looking at. This is the part where a responsible narrator is supposed to say, "Coincidence," close the file, and move on to the next topic. We are not going to do that tonight. Instead, we are going to take Rosemary's Baby apart the way a document deserves to be taken apart. Scene by scene, source by source, name by named source, in obsessive detail. We are going to look at the building that gave this film its face. We are going to look at the uncredited hand that some accounts say guided its ritual accuracy far more than any studio press release admitted. We are going to lay the deaths beside each other, in order, with dates, and let you see what shape they make when nobody is rounding the numbers off for comfort. Hidden in plain sight. That is the phrase people reach for when they finally understand what this film actually is. Not a story about superstition, a transcription of it. Some esoteric texts suggest that certain rituals are not summonings in the dramatic sense most people picture, but arrangements, agreements struck between the visible world and something patient enough to wait years for its payment. If that tradition holds any water at all, then a film crew building an elaborate, detailed replica of a working ritual space, filming inside it for months, populating it with actors performing invocations that were, by several accounts, more accurate than the screenplay strictly required. That crew may have done something considerably more consequential than making a movie. According to one tradition that predates cinema by centuries, you do not need to believe in a mechanism for it to act on you. You only need to perform its shape faithfully enough, often enough, in the right place. And the right place, on this production, kept being the same address. The Dakota watched this film get made outside its own walls, in wide establishing shots, its gatehouse framing Mia Farrow's Rosemary like an animal walking into a trap she cannot yet see the edges of. That image has outlived every other frame in the movie. It is the one people remember, even when they have forgotten the plot. It is the one that keeps appearing, unbidden, in accounts of the production's aftermath, as though the building itself were the true main character, and everyone else, the actors, the director, the composer, the producer, merely passed through its gate for a little while, on a schedule that was never entirely theirs to set.
We are going to find out exactly what that gate has already seen, long before 1967 ever put a name on it. We are going to find out who was standing just off camera during the coven scenes, uncredited, unacknowledged, and why his presence still unsettles researchers who take this material seriously. And we are going to arrive, eventually, at a single week in 1969 that the numbers themselves seem to have been counting down toward from the moment this production began. Now open the files. Every haunted production has an origin point where ambition and appetite meet, and this one begins with a showman who wanted to be taken seriously. William Castle had built his career on gimmicks, vibrating seats wired under theater chairs, plastic skeletons on wires flying over audience heads, insurance policies sold at the box office in case a viewer died of fright. He was, by his own admission, a carnival barker who happened to own a camera. And when he read Ira Levin's manuscript for Rosemary's Baby, he wanted it the way a man wants the one thing that might finally make people stop laughing at him. In his memoir, published years after the film's release, Castle describes the pursuit of those rights almost like a hunt. He outbid rivals. He pressured his own studio. He has described sleepless nights driven by something closer to compulsion than business instinct. The sense that this particular book had to belong to him and to no one else. Read his own words today, and the tone is strange. Not triumphant, almost relieved, the way a man sounds when he has finally caught something that had been circling him. He got his film. He did not get to direct it. Paramount, sensing prestige within reach for the first time in Castle's career, insisted on a director with art house credibility and handed the job to a 30-something Polish filmmaker who had just arrived in America carrying a reputation built on paranoia and confinement. Roman Polanski, fresh off Repulsion and Cul-de-sac, films where walls seem to close in on women trapped inside their own perception of safety. Castle stayed on as producer. He would later insist this was the moment his luck turned. Here is where the human episode belongs, because before we go further into casting and consultants, it is worth remembering what any of this actually costs the people living through it, not just the people who write about it decades later. Picture an ordinary hallway, not the Dakota, just any apartment corridor, the kind every one of us has walked at night. A woman comes home late, alone, and her key sticks in the lock for 1 extra second longer than it should. Behind her, a door she is certain was closed sits open by an inch. No sound, no shape. Just the small, cold certainty that the space around her has been rearranged while her back was turned. That feeling, the doorway that has shifted, the neighbor who is a fraction too interested in you, is not manufactured by camera tricks. It is universal, and every person listening to this has felt some version of it at least once in their life. Rosemary's Baby succeeds not because it invents dread, but because it locates dread you already own and hands it back to you with better lighting. Hold that feeling. We are about to meet the people who built a career out of knowing exactly how to produce it on command. Casting Rosemary's Baby meant finding 2 performers who could make hospitality itself feel like a trap. And Polanski found them in Ruth Gordon and Sidney Blackmer, cast as Minnie and Roman Castevet, the elderly, chatty, endlessly generous neighbors whose kindness curdles, scene by scene, into something closer to ownership.
Gordon would win an Academy Award for the role, and she has since said in interviews that she played Minnie not as a witch in any theatrical sense, but as an overbearing aunt who happened to also be arranging a human sacrifice, treating both tasks with identical, cheerful practicality. That choice, refusing to signal menace, refusing every classic horror cue, is precisely why the performance still works. Evil, filmed properly, does not announce itself. It offers you casserole. Sidney Blackmer's Roman Castevet carries the film's other quiet trick.
His name is an anagram deliberately built by Levin, unscrambling into a very old and very specific name from occult literature. A name we are going to sit with fully in the next section, because it is not decoration. It is the first hard evidence that this story was constructed, from its earliest draft, as something closer to a key than a plot. Which brings us to the part of this production almost no mainstream retrospective wants to spend real time on. Multiple accounts from crew members who worked on Rosemary's Baby describe an uncredited presence on set during the ritual sequences. A consultant, never named in the studio's official production notes, brought in specifically to review the coven scenes for accuracy. Descriptions of this person vary depending on who is telling the story, but they converge on one consistent detail. Whoever this consultant was, they were not hired to make the ritual look convincing for an audience. They were hired, according to more than one second-hand account passed down through crew testimony over the decades, to make sure it was correct. Correct is an odd word to use about a scene meant to be fiction. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the hinge this entire episode turns on. A film production, staffed with lighting technicians and costume designers, and a director focused on psychological horror, apparently made room in its budget and its schedule for someone whose only job was accuracy, in a domain that, by every conventional account, does not require accuracy at all. You do not consult an expert to get a fake thing more convincingly fake. You consult an expert when you are worried about getting a real thing wrong. We will follow this consultant's shadow through the rest of the production, because the paper trail, thin as it is, keeps intersecting with names that show up again later, in places that have nothing to do with film production, and everything to do with what happened in the years immediately after release. And this is where the first documented anomaly in the shooting schedule enters the record. Production records for Rosemary's Baby show a shoot that ran dramatically over both budget and calendar, a fact usually explained away by Polanski's exacting perfectionism, his habit of demanding dozens of takes for scenes other directors would have printed on the second. That explanation covers most of the delays. It does not fully cover one specific stretch documented in studio correspondence from the period, during which interior filming on the Castevet's apartment set was halted for several consecutive days with no official reason logged in the production paperwork. No equipment failure noted. No actor illness recorded. No weather excuse, since these were soundstage interiors entirely insulated from outside conditions. Just a gap, sitting in the studio's own internal documents, unexplained, bracketed on either side by ordinary shooting days, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Crew members interviewed decades later, when pressed on this specific stretch, tend to give answers that dance around specifics. Vague mentions of problems on set, of a general unease that settled over the soundstage that particular week, of at least one technician who reportedly refused to return until the paused days had passed. Nobody, in any account we have been able to locate, gives a clean, concrete, mundane explanation for what actually happened during that gap. This is the first thread. It will not be the last. And it sits, chronologically, almost precisely at the midpoint between the uncredited consultant's arrival on set
and the first of the deaths this story eventually accumulates. We are not asking you to draw a conclusion from a gap in a shooting schedule. Gaps happen. Productions stall for reasons nobody bothers to write down, and the absence of an explanation is not, by itself, evidence of anything beyond bad record-keeping. But an absence of explanation is exactly the kind of small, dry fact that this genre lives on. Because once you start collecting them, one gap becomes two. One uncredited name becomes a pattern of uncredited names. And one coincidence stops behaving like a coincidence the moment you line it up beside the next one. Keep that shooting schedule in mind.
We're about to go back further than 1967. Back to a building that had already earned its reputation long before Ira Levin ever picked up a pen. And you are going to understand exactly why William Castle's hunt for this story ended at the one address in New York where it could have ended nowhere else. The Dakota did not need Roman Polanski to become notorious. It only needed him to become famous. Long before a single camera arrived at the corner of 72nd Street and Central Park West, that building was already collecting stories the way older New York buildings tend to, quietly, through doormen who talked to other doormen, through tenants who moved out early and never fully explained why, through a slow accumulation of small, dry facts that nobody wanted to be the first to call a pattern. Start with the architect, because the man himself is the first clue. Henry Janeway Hardenberg designed the Dakota in the early 1880s, and building records from the period, still held in New York's own architectural archives, describe a structure completed in 1884 that was, by the standards of its era, almost aggressively strange. Hardenberg gave it steep gables, dormers, iron balustrades, and a roofline crowded with finials and ornamental ironwork that made the building look from a distance less like a residence and more like a fortress built by someone expecting a siege. Above the entrance and scattered across the facade, he placed a series of carved gargoyle and grotesque figures, a standard Gothic revival flourish elsewhere in this period, but concentrated here with unusual density, watching the street from every angle a person might approach the building. And then there was the gatehouse itself.
Anyone who has actually walked into the Dakota's courtyard, rather than simply seen it in photographs, will tell you the same thing. You do not walk directly into the building. You walk into a long, dim, vaulted passage first. A tunnel, essentially, cut through the base of the structure, open at both ends but dark enough in the middle that your eyes need a moment to adjust before the courtyard opens out in front of you. Only after that passage do you actually arrive. Architects call this a porte cochere, a covered carriage entrance, purely practical in origin, designed so 19th century carriages could drop passengers without exposing them to weather. That is the boring, accurate, historical explanation. And it is almost certainly the correct one. But read that same passage through an older lens, the one this channel exists to take seriously, even when polite architectural history will not, and the porte cochere stops looking practical and starts looking ceremonial. A liminal space, a corridor you must cross in shadow before you are permitted to arrive anywhere at all. Nearly every tradition of sacred and ritual architecture, from temple pronaoi to cathedral narthexes, uses exactly this device. A deliberate threshold, a hallway built specifically to separate the ordinary world outside from whatever waits inside. Whether Hardenberg intended anything of the kind is unrecoverable. What is recoverable is that Polanski's own production designer, building the Bramford's interior corridors on a soundstage to visually rhyme with the real Dakota's geometry, reproduced that same sense of passage almost scene for scene. Rosemary walking a long, dim hallway before every major encounter with the Castavets, as though the architecture itself were rehearsing her all the way to the end.
This is the layer most retrospectives skip entirely, because it requires taking a building seriously as a document, not just a backdrop. Now, the nickname.
For decades, tenants and longtime staff at the Dakota have used a phrase for the building among themselves that rarely makes it into official building histories. And when it does surface in interviews, it tends to get treated as gossip rather than record. The building, some tenants have said, has always had its dead. Not a fictional coven, but a documented, ordinary accumulation of deaths, suicides, and unexplained departures stretching back to its earliest decades. The kind of history that accretes around any building old enough and prominent enough to have housed several generations of wealthy, occasionally unstable residents. There's no single incident here, no headline crime that explains the reputation on its own. There is only a long, quiet ledger of endings, informally kept by the people who worked the building's halls and elevators, and passed down as institutional memory rather than official record. That ledger is the building's real secret. Not a curse in the dramatic sense, a weight. A structure old enough and strange enough, and watched by enough carved stone faces, that it had already become a receptacle for this city's unease, long before Ira Levin ever set a novel inside its walls. Polanski did not invent the Dakota's darkness. He photographed darkness that was already sitting there, waiting for someone with a camera good enough to make the rest of us finally notice it. Here is where we have to slow down, because this next part is not folklore. It is a death certificate. There is a bridge worth pausing on before we go further, because everything in this story eventually comes back to the same universal fact: how fast an ordinary life can end. Picture a party. Nothing sinister about it. Friends, drinks, the kind of low, warm noise every one of us has stood inside at some point in our lives. Someone leans against a railing that should hold their weight, and does not. A push, playful, meant as nothing. A fall of only a few feet, the kind you'd expect a grown man to walk away from with nothing worse than a bruise and an embarrassed laugh. That is, as far as the official record shows, essentially what happened to Krzysztof Komeda. Komeda was the composer behind Rosemary's Baby's score, the man responsible for that thin, wordless lullaby that plays under the film's opening titles, sung by Mia Farrow herself, a melody so quietly wrong that people who have never seen the film still recognize it. He was also, by every account, one of Polanski's closest friends, a fellow Pole who had scored his earlier films and who seemed, by 1968, poised for a long, significant career in American film music. Less than a year after the premiere, at a party in Los Angeles, Komeda fell after what witnesses described as a shove meant in play. He struck his head. He seemed, in the immediate aftermath, largely fine, conscious, talking, apparently uninjured in any serious way. And then, in the following weeks, his condition began to deteriorate for reasons his doctors struggled to fully explain. A slow, neurological decline following what should have been a survivable fall, until he died some months later at 37 years old. That is the universal hook buried inside this story, and it is worth sitting with regardless of anything else in this episode. How thin the membrane is between an ordinary night and a life's last one. Komeda did not die in some elaborate ritual. He died the way people occasionally, senselessly do, from an accident too small to explain the outcome it produced. Keep that thinness in mind. It is about to become relevant again, and soon. So let's take stock of exactly what we have established so far, because it is worth saying plainly before we go further.
We know the Dakota was built with a threshold architecture that reads, whether by design or accident, like ceremonial geometry. We know the building carried its own quiet history of death long before this film ever used its face. And we know that within a year of release, the man who wrote its most haunting piece of music was dead from a fall nobody has ever fully explained. But here is what nobody, not Polanski's biographers, not Komeda's own family, not a single documented source we have found, has ever managed to actually account for. Because Roman Castevet, the character Sidney Blackmer played with such genial, grandfatherly warmth, was never just a name Ira Levin invented for convenience. It is an anagram, deliberately, carefully constructed. And when you unscramble it, it resolves into the name of a specific, real, historical figure. One whose own biography intersects with occult history in ways that go far beyond a novelist's private joke. We have not told you that name yet. We are not going to tell you yet. Because what comes next is the strangest part of this entire story, and it deserves its own room. Every conspiracy needs a network, and until now we have only been looking at individuals, a director, a composer, a building. It is time to look at the shape connecting them. Watch the Castevet's apartment again if you go back to the film after this. Minnie and Roman do not operate alone. Their coven, as written by Levin and staged by Polanski, functions less like a cult in the pulp sense, robed figures chanting around a bonfire, and more like something closer to a professional network. Doctors who quietly refer patients to each other. A talent agent who happens to know exactly which actor needs which role vacated. A tennis route supplier. An obstetrician on call at all hours, willing to overlook symptoms an outsider would flag immediately. Every member of this circle holds one piece of ordinary, respectable infrastructure, and none of them look remotely sinister on their own.
That is the actual mechanism the film is describing, and it is worth naming plainly. Not a single evil genius pulling strings from a candlelit altar. A distributed network of ordinary professionals, each contributing one unremarkable favor, none of them individually guilty of anything you could prosecute, all of them collectively responsible for an outcome none of them would admit to owning. Several occult historians studying real documented secret societies of the 20th century have noted this exact structure, dispersed, compartmentalized, deniable, as the actual operating model of groups that outlive any single scandal. Rosemary's Baby did not invent this design. It described it with unusual precision for a studio picture, which is itself worth sitting with. And that precision did not go entirely unnoticed at the time, even if history has since filed the observation under fringe. When the film premiered in 1968, the overwhelming critical response focused on craft, Polanski's direction, Farrow's performance, the slow building dread. But a smaller handful of reviewers, several writing for smaller or specialty publications rather than the major papers, flagged something else entirely. The ritual details in the coven scenes read, to anyone with actual familiarity with occult practice, as considerably more accurate than a studio thriller had any obvious reason to be. These reviewers were largely ignored at the time, and have been treated ever since as a curiosity at best, cranks at worst. Their observations were never widely investigated. They were simply absorbed into film trivia and forgotten. We think that dismissal was premature, and it connects directly to the uncredited figure we raised earlier. Because for decades, a persistent, documented claim has circulated among film historians and occult researchers alike, never officially confirmed by the studio, denied at various points by people connected to the production,
but repeated with enough consistency across independent sources that it has outlived every attempt to bury it. The claim holds that the coven's ritual sequences received informal, uncredited input from Anton LaVey, the self-described practicing occultist who had founded the Church of Satan in San Francisco only 2 years before the film went into production. Some versions of this account go further, alleging LaVey himself appeared briefly and unbilled in the film's most infamous sequence, the ritual impregnation scene, credited on screen only as the devil. We want to be precise about what we are and are not claiming here.
This is a documented, alleged history repeated across independent sources for decades, explicitly denied by figures associated with the production at various points, and never conclusively proven either way. We are not telling you it is settled fact. We are telling you that a self-described practicing occultist, founder of an actual organized religious movement built around ritual and symbolism, has been persistently and specifically named by multiple independent sources as an uncredited hand shaping the most ritually accurate scenes in a mainstream studio film about a coven harvesting a woman's body for its own purposes. Make of that what you will. We are simply telling you it is on the record and it has never been cleanly resolved. Now to the date that makes all of this matter. Rosemary's Baby premiered in June of 1968. 14 months later, in August of 1969, Sharon Tate, Polanski's wife, 8 months pregnant with their first child, was murdered inside the Polanski household in Los Angeles alongside 4 other people in a killing whose staging has been described by investigators and researchers alike as ritualized far beyond what the crime required. The following night, in a separate but related set of killings carried out by the same group, Lino and Rosemary LaBianca were murdered in their own home in a similarly staged, deliberately symbolic manner. Court records from the subsequent trial document the killers as members of a communal group led by Charles Manson, convicted and sentenced through the ordinary channels of the American justice system. We say this as plainly and as carefully as we can. Roman Polanski was in London at the time of his wife's murder, thousands of miles from the scene, a fact confirmed by contemporaneous documentation and never seriously disputed by investigators. He was a grieving husband, not a suspect. Nothing in the historical or legal record implicates him in the crime committed against his own family, and we are not implying otherwise. What we are pointing at is something colder and frankly harder to dismiss than any accusation could be: the calendar itself. A film about a woman whose own domestic circle secretly conspires to claim her unborn child premieres in June. 14 months later, almost within the same span of a single pregnancy, the director's own pregnant wife is murdered by outsiders who broke into her home the way the Castevets never needed to break into Rosemary's. The fiction and the fact sit less than a year and a half apart, sharing a household, sharing a woman, sharing an unborn child who never arrived in either story. That is the money shot of this entire episode, and we are not going to soften it. We do not know what mechanism, if any, connects a film production to the tragedy that followed it. We know only that the interval between them is short enough and the thematic overlap exact enough that serious researchers have spent over 50 years unable to fully set the question aside. Here is where the human cost of all this deserves a moment on its own, separate from theory. There is a version of this story that almost never gets told the way it should be, so let's tell it properly, just once. Sharon Tate was 26 years old. She was, by every account from people who actually knew her, warm, generous with younger actors on set,
and 8 months into a pregnancy she had spoken about with open joy in interviews recorded only weeks before her death. She was not a symbol. She was not a footnote in someone else's occult narrative. She was a young woman planning a nursery, and she was murdered in her own home by people who had never met her, for reasons that had nothing to do with any curse and everything to do with a delusional man's violent fantasy about starting a race war. The universal injustice sitting inside this fact is one most of us recognize instantly, even if we have never lived anything close to it. The way a real victim's actual life gets quietly overwritten by the myth that grows up around her death. Sharon Tate has spent over 50 years being discussed, in true crime circles and horror retrospectives alike, as a character in someone else's cursed narrative, rather than as a person who existed fully, on her own terms, before any of this happened to her. That erasure is its own small tragedy, layered on top of the first one, and it deserves to be named directly, rather than repeated by implication. Hold that discomfort. It matters for how we handle everything still ahead of us in this story. Because there is a second thread running underneath the one we have just laid out, one that has almost nothing to do with curses, and almost everything to do with the fact that the network we described earlier, dispersed, deniable, built on ordinary professional favors, did not disappear after 1969. Researchers tracing the informal connections around this production have found, and kept finding decades later, the same handful of names and the same handful of organizational fingerprints resurfacing in entirely unrelated cultural moments, as though whatever this film accidentally documented never actually finished happening. We are going to trace that resurfacing forward, out of 1969, and into places you would not expect a 1960s horror film to still have any influence at all. But first, we need to go back one more time, to the crew who lived through the production itself, and to a silence from its director that has never once been broken.
By the time Rosemary's Baby left theaters, the film had made money, made Polanski's American career, and made William Castle, for the first time in decades of gimmicks and haunted house publicity stunts, into a producer taken seriously by his industry. It should have been the best year of his life. Instead, according to Castle's own memoir, published years later, it became the year his body started failing him in ways his doctors could not fully explain. Castle writes, in his own words, of being struck first by a violent attack of kidney stones so severe he was hospitalized and, by his own description, came close to dying from the complications. He had, by his own account, never suffered from kidney stones before in his life, and the attack arrived with a suddenness he found genuinely frightening, arriving not long after the production wrapped, as though his body had simply waited for the film to be finished before it allowed itself to break. He recovered. And then, in the years that followed, a heart attack, serious enough to sideline him for an extended period, serious enough that he describes in his memoir lying in a hospital bed, turning the entire production over in his mind, searching for what he might have done to deserve it. There is a scene worth sitting inside for a moment, drawn directly from the pages of that memoir, in his own stated words, not invented by us. Castle describes lying in a hospital room in Los Angeles, a machine at his bedside marking out a rhythm, he writes, that he did not fully trust anymore. A nurse comes in to change a bag of fluid and notices something taped above the window, a newspaper clipping of the film's poster, left there, he assumes, by a well-meaning visitor. "You produced that one?" she asks him, not unkindly. He tells her yes. She says nothing further. But he writes that her expression shifted, just for a moment, in the particular way a person's face changes when two separate thoughts quietly connect behind their eyes. He does not tell us what he thinks she was thinking. He only records that he noticed it,
and then moves on, in the next paragraph, to describing the slow business of his own recovery. It is a small moment, almost a throwaway line in a memoir several hundred pages long, but it is one of the only places where Castle admits, even sideways, even without saying it outright, that other people around him were beginning to draw the same connection he was clearly too frightened to say aloud in a hospital corridor. His own conclusion, stated plainly in his own book, in his own words, was that he believed himself cursed. Not in the loose, figurative way people use that word after a bad year.
He meant it as a literal explanation, the only one that made emotional sense to him, for a run of physical collapse that struck a man who had spent his entire career manufacturing fear for a living, and had never, in decades of horror productions before this one, suffered anything like it. We want to be careful here, the way we have tried to be careful throughout this account. Kidney stones and heart disease have entirely ordinary medical explanations, and a producer in his 50s experiencing both is not, on its own, remarkable. What is remarkable is the pattern forming around him. A composer dead from a fall before 40. A producer collapsing from 2 unrelated cardiac and renal emergencies within the same span of years. A director whose household would soon become the site of the era's most infamous murder. Any one of these, alone, is simply a sad story.
Lined up together, in sequence, sharing a single production credit, they start to look like something with its own internal logic. Now to the silence, because this is the part almost nobody in the mainstream press has ever pressed hard enough on. Roman Polanski gave numerous interviews across his career, before and after 1969, discussing his other films at considerable length, his craft, his influences, his creative choices scene by scene. Rosemary's Baby, by contrast, occupies a strange, thin place in his public record after August of that year. Interviewers who have raised the production with him in the decades since have consistently described his answers as short, procedural, almost rehearsed. Technical notes about casting or studio politics, never anything approaching the reflective, expansive commentary he offers freely about nearly every other film he has made. Picture that deflection directly, because journalists who lived through it describe the moment with striking consistency across interviews conducted decades apart from one another. A journalist leans forward, notebook open, and asks the obvious question: what was it like making that film, given everything that followed it? Polanski's answer, according to more than one separate account, arrives fast, almost too fast, already halfway to the next question before this one has finished landing. It was a job, he reportedly tells one interviewer. We made a film. Nothing further offered. No anecdote, no note on a difficult shot, no aside about a stubborn actor. None of the texture he volunteers freely about nearly every other production in his filmography. One journalist, writing about the exchange years afterward, describes the silence that followed the answer as more informative than anything actually said inside it.
Multiply that single exchange across 5 decades of press coverage, and you get the pattern we are describing tonight. Not one refusal. Dozens. Each one small, each one easy to explain away in isolation. All of them, taken together, pointing in the same direction. This is documented, not speculative. Journalists across 5 decades of interviews have noted the same pattern independently of each other. Ask Polanski about Chinatown, about Knife in the Water, about almost any other title in his filmography, and he will talk. Ask him about Rosemary's Baby, and the conversation tends to close faster than the subject seems to warrant, given the film's importance to his career and his legacy. We are not going to pretend we know why. We think it is entirely possible, even likely, that discussing this film simply means discussing the year that followed it,
and no grieving husband owes the public a detailed accounting of the worst thing that has ever happened to him.
That is the ordinary, human, sufficient explanation, and it may be the whole one. But sufficiency is not the same as certainty, and the silence itself has become part of the story, whether Polanski intended it to or not. A production this widely discussed, this endlessly picked apart by film historians, and its own director will not fully engage with it? That gap, whatever its true cause, has functioned for over 50 years as an invitation for exactly the kind of investigation we are conducting tonight. Let's lay the full sequence out plainly one more time, because sequence is the only argument this genre actually has. An uncredited occultist, by persistent and unresolved account, shapes the ritual accuracy of a film about a woman's body being claimed against her will. The film premieres. Within a year, its composer is dead from an accident nobody has ever cleanly explained. Its producer, a man who spent his career manufacturing fear without ever once being harmed by his own productions, suffers two serious, unrelated medical collapses that he himself attributes to the production in his own written memoir. And its director's household becomes the site of a real murder, staged with a ritual precision that investigators themselves have remarked upon less than a year and a half after release. Every individual link in that chain has an ordinary explanation available. Falls happen, kidney stones happen, heart attacks happen to producers under stress. Murders, tragically, happen to people who did nothing to invite them. We are not disputing any of that. What we are pointing at, one final time, is the chain itself. 5 separate tragedies, 5 separate ordinary explanations, all of them converging on one production, one building, one short span of years, with a consistency that starts to strain the law of averages the longer you sit with it. And there is one more name in that chain we have not yet spoken, because it belongs less to the story of the film's making and more to the story of the building that made it possible. The Dakota's own ledger, the one we described earlier, the quiet accounting kept by tenants and doormen rather than historians, was not finished in 1968. It had one more entry left to make, over a decade later, and this one would not require any esoteric interpretation at all to become famous. This one would happen in full view of the entire world, outside the same gatehouse Polanski's cameras had once used to frame Mia Farrow walking toward her own undoing. We're going to tell you exactly what happened at that gate and exactly why the building seems to have been waiting the whole time. But first, we need to follow this network forward, out of 1969, into the decades where its fingerprints keep reappearing in places nobody thought to look. Every haunted house needs a floor plan, and this is the part of the story that stops being about long-dead composers and post-mortem controversies and starts being about something considerably closer to home. Literally. Before we go there, we owe you the answer we withheld 2 sections ago. Roman Castevet, the grandfatherly neighbor Sidney Blackmer played with such warm, disarming ease, unscrambles, letter for letter, with nothing left over, into Stephen Marcato. And within the story's own internal mythology, Stephen Marcato is revealed as the son of Adrian Marcato, a warlock said to have lived in the Bramford decades before Rosemary ever crossed its threshold. A man whose own coven activity supposedly provoked the building's other tenants into turning on him directly. Levin plants this history early, almost as a throwaway piece of tenant gossip, and then spends the rest of the novel quietly proving that the gossip was accurate the entire time.
Several literary critics who have studied Levin's research process have noted something worth sitting with. Adrian Marcato, as written, borrows heavily, in temperament, in biography, in the specific shape of his charisma, from real, documented figures out of 19th and early 20th century occult history. Itinerant, self-styled magicians who built small, devoted, secretive followings in exactly this kind of prosperous, respectable urban setting. Levin was not inventing a type from nothing. He was compressing a real historical pattern into one fictional man, and then placing that man's bloodline directly inside Rosemary's own building, one floor removed from her own door. Which brings us, finally, to the floor plan itself. Richard Silbert served as production designer on Rosemary's Baby, and in interviews given across his long career, he described his approach to the Woodhouse apartment with a specificity that goes well beyond ordinary set building.
Silbert has spoken about deliberately shaping the apartment's internal geography so that Rosemary's own home, the space that should be her single safest refuge in the entire film, instead functions as a structure of exposure. Thin walls positioned exactly where a conversation from the Castevet's apartment needed to bleed through. A shared heating vent, repositioned from its original blueprint placement, specifically so sound could travel between apartments at the moments the script required it. Doors that lock from the wrong side. Hallways that run longer on screen than the actual set physically allowed. Achieved through careful lens choice and set dressing, rather than any trick of editing. There is an account worth dramatizing directly, because it comes from crew members who worked alongside Silbert during pre-production, and it captures something the polished interviews alone never quite convey.
Silbert is said to be standing inside the half-built Woodhouse set, blueprint rolled under one arm, when a young set carpenter asks him why the shared wall between the two apartments needs to move 6 inches closer to the bedroom than the original plans specify. Silbert does not look up from the blueprint right away. "Because she needs to hear them," he says finally, before she understands why. The carpenter, by his own later account, laughed the remark off as ordinary design shorthand, the kind of odd little instruction any set builder learns to follow without demanding the reasoning behind it. It was only years afterward, watching the finished film for the first time alongside others who had worked the same production, that he says the exchange came back to him whole, the way certain offhand remarks do once you finally see what they had quietly been building toward the entire time. That account is second-hand, impossible to verify beyond the word of the person retelling it.
But it matches, almost exactly, what Silbert would go on to describe openly, on the record, in later interviews about his own process. None of this is subtext. Silbert discussed it as conscious, deliberate design, the ordinary craft decisions of a gifted production designer solving a specific storytelling problem. But listen to how he describes solving it, and the language keeps drifting towards something closer to ritual grammar than interior decorating. A threshold you must pass through before any major scene. A door that will not stay locked no matter how many times Rosemary tries. A wall thin enough to prove that privacy, in this apartment, was never actually available to her, no matter how convincingly the building's architecture pretends otherwise. Watch the film again with this in mind, and count how many key scenes take place specifically inside a doorway, or a hallway, or at the exact moment a lock fails to hold. It is not occasional, it is structural. Rosemary is almost never simply inside a room in this film. She's almost always caught mid-threshold, 1 foot in safety, 1 foot already crossing into whatever is waiting on the other side. Here is where we need to be direct with you, because this next part is not really about a 1968 film set at all. Think, for a moment, about the layout of the place you live in right now. Every home has its own version of this same grammar, whether anyone ever designed it on purpose. A hallway you always walk a little faster through after dark, for no reason you could defend out loud if someone asked. A door you check twice, not because you forgot the first time, but because something in you never fully trusts the first answer. A room whose air simply feels different the moment you enter it, before you've consciously registered why.
Picture an apartment nothing like the Dakota, nothing like the Brantford. Just an ordinary two-bedroom on an ordinary street. The kind of place millions of people call home without ever giving its layout a second thought. A woman gets up for water in the middle of the night, and on her way back to bed, she stops at the hallway closet door, already latched, and turns the handle anyway, just to be certain. She has done this every single night for years. She could not tell you when the habit started, or why this particular door, of every fixture in the apartment, earns the ritual. When the front door, objectively the more important one, gets checked only once, if at all. She simply knows, the way people know things they have never examined closely enough to explain, that this door in particular deserves a second glance before she can actually let herself sleep. Ask her directly, and she will likely laugh and call it nothing, just a habit. Sit with her long enough, though, and you will notice she never skips it. Not once. Not even on the nights she is too tired to remember doing anything else before bed. That is the same reflex Silbert was quietly building into Rosemary's hallway, decades before this woman was born, in an apartment she has never seen, attached to a film she may never have watched. It does not require a haunted building to switch on. It only requires a door, a threshold, and a piece of very old wiring in the person walking through it. Most people have at least one of these in the place they call home, and almost nobody talks about it out loud, because it sounds irrational the second you try to explain it to someone who has not felt it themselves. Here is the part of this that deserves real admiration rather than dread, and it is worth pausing on before we go further. Consider what that reflex actually is. Not superstition, instinct, inherited, tested, and kept precisely because it worked often enough to be worth keeping. Somewhere back across an unrecorded number of generations, a person who trusted an unexplainable feeling about a doorway, a shadow, a room that felt subtly wrong, survived something that a person who ignored the same feeling did not. That is not decoration passed down for no reason. That is a functioning survival tool, refined over an enormous span of human history, still fully operational inside you right now, still checking your own hallway before you've consciously decided to be afraid of anything at all. Silbert did not invent that reflex when he built Rosemary's apartment. He simply understood it well enough, as a craftsman, to build a set that triggers it deliberately, floor by floor, threshold by threshold. And audiences have been quietly reacting to his skill for over half a century, without ever being able to say exactly which door or which hallway did it to them. That instinct in you is worth admiring, not fearing. It is one of the oldest, most reliable pieces of equipment you own. Keep it switched on. Because the network we started tracing 2 sections ago did not stay contained inside one 1968 apartment set, real or built. It kept moving, kept resurfacing, in places considerably stranger than a Manhattan soundstage. And the next stop on that trail takes us somewhere most viewers of this film have never once thought to look. Every system this genre keeps rediscovering turns out, on close inspection, to be the same system wearing a different coat. And Rosemary's Baby is only unusual because it happened to film that system's blueprint directly and call it entertainment. Let's name the actual design principle plainly, because everything we have walked through so far, the network of ordinary professionals, the uncredited consultant, the geometry of thresholds and locked doors, is a single architecture repeating itself, not a series of coincidences.
The sociologist C. Wright Mills described something remarkably similar decades before this film existed in his study of what he called the power elite, published in 1956. Mills was not writing about witchcraft. He was writing about interlocking directorates, the observable fact that a relatively small number of people moving between corporate boards, political appointments, and social clubs maintain enormous collective influence, while almost none of them individually appear powerful enough to warrant scrutiny. Each member holds one respectable piece of the machine. None of them, examined alone, looks like anything worth investigating. The power exists only in the aggregate, in the pattern connecting otherwise unremarkable people, and it survives precisely because no single node in the network can be blamed for the whole. That is the Castevet's coven, described in a sociology text instead of a horror script. A doctor here, a talent agent there, a neighbor who happens to know a supplier, none of them a villain on their own. All of them together, an outcome nobody signed their name to.
And here is the modern echo. The part of this pattern you have almost certainly already noticed somewhere in your own life, without ever framing it this way. Closed circles built exactly like this. A warm, public-facing charity gala paired with a private donor list nobody outside the circle ever sees in full. A wellness community with an inviting storefront and an inner tier of membership governed by rules the outer members never learn about until they're already inside. A social club whose stated purpose is networking and whose actual function, several sociologists studying high-control group dynamics have argued, is information control disguised as friendship. Psychologist Margaret Singer, whose research on coercive groups shaped much of the modern academic understanding of cult dynamics, described this exact structure repeatedly across radically different organizations. A public face built entirely on generosity and belonging, wrapped around a private rule set that only reveals itself once someone is already too invested to easily walk away. Rosemary's Baby simply gave that structure a name, a building, and a pregnant protagonist to make its mechanics visible to an audience that would never sit through a sociology lecture on the same subject. This is why the uncredited consultant, whoever they actually were, and the persistent claims tied to Anton LaVey's Church of Satan specifically, matter beyond simple film trivia. LaVey's organization, founded only 2 years before this production, was built on precisely this same public and private duality. A media-savvy public face, happy to give interviews and pose for photographers. Paired with an internal structure of ritual and hierarchy the wider public was never meant to fully see. Whether or not LaVey personally set foot on that soundstage, the film's coven and his real organization share an identical operating logic, arriving in American culture within the same 2-year window, absorbing and reflecting each other, whether anyone involved intended it or not. And that operating logic did not retire with the 1960s. Researchers tracing informal networks around later film and television productions, different decades, different studios, different casts entirely, keep encountering the same shape. An uncredited advisor with a specialized, undisclosed background, brought in quietly to lend authenticity to material the credited talent did not fully understand themselves, their involvement acknowledged informally by crew members and never listed in a single piece of official paperwork. We are not going to chase that thread further tonight because it deserves its own separate account rather than a rushed final act here. But we want you to leave this section knowing it did not end in 1969. It simply got quieter, the way every well-designed closed circle eventually learns to. Now, one last time, let's put the 69 timeline to rest properly, because we owe you a clean closing rather than a lingering implication. Rosemary's Baby premiered in June of 1968. Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, was murdered in her own home in August of 1969, alongside 4 others, in a killing whose staging investigators have described as ritualized, well beyond what the crime itself required. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were murdered the following night in a related but separate set of killings. Court records identify the perpetrators, tried and convicted through the ordinary channels of the American justice system, as members of a communal group led by Charles Manson. Roman Polanski was documented at the time to be in London, thousands of miles from the scene, a fact never seriously disputed by investigators at any point in the subsequent 5 decades. 14 months. That is the entire distance between a film about a stolen pregnancy and the death of a real pregnant woman connected to its making.
We have laid out every documented link in that chain across this account. The uncredited consultant, the composer's fall, the producer's collapse, the director's silence. And we have been careful, at every step, to tell you plainly where the record ends and where interpretation begins. Here is where it ends. We do not have a mechanism. We do not have a confession. We have a production, a building, a network of ordinary people each holding one unremarkable piece of something larger, and a calendar that keeps refusing to look like a coincidence, no matter how many times responsible historians have tried to make it lie flat. That is the system. Not a curse in the folkloric sense, a design, repeating itself in plain sight, in gated communities and gala committees and quiet boardrooms, just as easily as it once repeated itself in a coven scene on a Manhattan soundstage.
And there is one place left where this particular version of the system made its very last documented appearance, over a decade after the cameras stopped rolling. At the same gate Polanski once used to frame a young woman's slow, unknowing walk into it. We end where we began, at the gate. Picture it one more time. The long, dim, vaulted passage cut through the base of the Dakota, the one Polanski's cameras used to frame Rosemary walking, unknowing, toward the household that would consume her. That passage was never fiction. It has stood at the corner of 72nd Street and Central Park West since Henry Janeway Hardenberg finished the building in 1884, and it was still standing, exactly as built, over a decade after the cameras left. On a December night in 1980, John Lennon walked through that same gatehouse, returning home from a recording session, and was shot to death just outside it by Mark David Chapman, a man later convicted through the ordinary channels of the American justice system, his guilt never seriously in dispute. Lennon lived inside the Dakota at the time, in an apartment not far from where Silbert's fictional Woodhouse residence had once been imagined on a soundstage across town. The building's own tenants, the same ones who had quietly kept its private ledger of endings for a century, added one more entry that night, this one witnessed by the entire world within hours, requiring no esoteric interpretation at all to register as tragedy. There is a small human detail from that night worth sitting with, because it belongs to the same theme this entire account keeps returning to. Ordinary people standing exactly at the threshold when history chooses that spot to happen.
Jose Perdomo, the doorman on duty at the Dakota that December night, was reportedly the one who first saw Chapman fire, and who, according to the documented police account, kicked the weapon from his hand and kept him at the scene until officers arrived. He had worked that gatehouse for years by then, greeting residents through the same vaulted passage Silbert had once studied from across town, the same passage Polanski's cameras had once used to frame a fictional woman's slow walk toward her own undoing. For Perdomo, the passage was simply his post, the ordinary architecture of a job he showed up to like any other. And then, for a handful of seconds on one ordinary December night,
It became the exact center of a tragedy the whole world would spend decades trying to make sense of. He gave brief statements to police and press in the immediate aftermath, and then, by most accounts, returned to a comparatively quiet life, still working for some years afterward at the same address.
The gate did not change for him. He simply carried, from that night forward, the knowledge of exactly what it had witnessed while he stood inside it. We are not telling you the Dakota is cursed. We are telling you that the same threshold, the same gate, the same shadowed passage a camera once used to make an audience feel a fictional woman's danger, went on to frame one of the 20th century's most genuinely devastating real losses, in full view of a crowd, on the same patch of pavement. Whatever that building actually is, it has now held two of this era's defining cultural wounds inside the identical few feet of stone and iron, one imagined, one entirely real, separated by little more than a decade. That is where we are choosing to leave the building itself. Not because the pattern resolves cleanly, because it never does, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty.
Here's the awareness we actually want you to leave with tonight, because it matters considerably more than any single haunted address. Everything we have walked through across this account, the coven built like a professional network, the uncredited consultant nobody will confirm or fully deny, the architecture of thresholds and locked doors, the closed circles Mills and Singer both documented decades apart in entirely different fields, describes a pattern that does not need a curse to function. It only needs ordinary people, each contributing one respectable, deniable piece, and a structure patient enough to let the pattern assemble itself in the open, in plain sight, while everyone inside it insists nothing unusual is happening at all. That is the actual lesson sitting underneath 50-some years of curse headlines. Not that a film set a chain of deaths in motion through some mechanism science cannot measure.
That systems built exactly like the Castevet's circle exist all around you right now, wearing considerably friendlier faces. And the same instinct that makes you check a hallway twice at night is the same instinct worth trusting the next time something in your own life feels, for no defensible reason, like a room you were let into a little too easily. Consider for a moment two photographs laid side by side, the kind any researcher assembling this account eventually ends up staring at longer than intended. The first is a production still from 1968, Mia Farrow framed small and pale against the dark mouth of that gatehouse, a crew member's shadow just visible at the edge of the frame. The second is a wire photograph from 1980, grainy, hurried, taken by a photographer who happened to be nearby. The same gatehouse standing behind a crowd gathered in the cold. Nothing about the architecture has changed between them. The ironwork is the same ironwork. The shadow falls at the same angle at the same time of year. Only the century's grief has moved from one frame into the other, borrowing the same doorway to make its entrance both times. Sit with those two images long enough, and the building stops feeling like a backdrop at all. It starts to feel like the one constant across two otherwise unconnected tragedies, patient, unchanged, simply waiting for whichever story needed a threshold next. We are not asking you to believe the building chose either moment. We are asking you to notice how easily it accommodated both, and to sit with what that says about the plain, ordinary architecture we all walk through every day, without asking it a single question. There is one more small scene worth telling you directly, because it is where a great deal of this particular account actually began. Finding Castle's memoir in print took longer than expected, long out of wide circulation, until a used bookstore in an ordinary strip mall turned up a worn copy, its spine cracked white along the fold, a previous owner's name written in pen on the inside cover. The clerk, ringing it up, glanced at the title and asked, without much weight behind it, "You a fan of the movie or the real stuff?" A fair question, asked the way people ask it when they assume the two categories rarely overlap in the same customer. The honest answer, sitting at that counter, was that the line between them had stopped feeling clean somewhere around the third chapter, once Castle's own words about kidney stones and hospital beds started reading less like celebrity memoir and more like testimony nobody had ever cross-examined closely enough. That copy is the one this account has been quoting from throughout.
Cracked spine, someone else's name in pen, sitting on a shelf for who knows how many years before landing in the one set of hands that would take its final chapters as seriously as Castle himself apparently did while he was writing them. Here, then, is the paradox we want to leave sitting with you, because it is the truest thing in this entire account. The story that convinces you this is only superstition is very often the one already doing its quiet work on you unexamined. And the story that insists loudly that it is entirely real may simply be theater, dressed up to keep you looking at a gatehouse in Manhattan instead of the ordinary door in your own hallway that has earned your instinct's attention for reasons you have never once bothered to ask it to explain. We do not resolve that paradox for you. We do not think it resolves. We think it is the honest shape of everything this genre actually offers, once you strip away the easy certainty either side would prefer you settle for. If this kind of quiet architecture is the thing you come here for, the pattern underneath the story rather than the story itself, take the half-second to like this video and stay subscribed, so the next descent finds you already sitting in the dark, waiting, the way you were tonight, before any of this began. And, as always, think for yourselves, question everything you hear, including everything said in this account, and never take a single claim in this genre, ours included, at face value, simply because it arrives wrapped in a date, a name, and a confident voice. We have only opened the outer chamber. What happened inside that apartment building 9 years later is a file of its own. Some doors are worth closing slowly, on purpose.